Howdy friends, Bevin Cohen here from Small House Farm with some tips and tricks for planting your spring garden. Even though it may still be wintertime where we're at, this is the time to start planning for a successful harvest in the fall. One of my favorite parts about planting the garden in the spring is browsing through the seed catalogs. All the beautiful pictures and diversity, all these different fruits and vegetables to choose from. So we can choose some of our favorites, some of our favorite things to eat. There's always something new and exciting to try. I always like to pick at least 2 or 3 crops I've never even grown before and try them again. Gardening's always an adventure. While it may seem like there's just endless abundance to choose from in these seed catalogs, we don't want to overdo it. It's to understand how much space we have available to us in our garden. If you're just growing out in your yard or with some raised beds, just taking the tape measure out there and giving it a quick measurement will give you a great idea of your available growing space. Even in a larger garden, understanding the square footage of the space available is going to make sure that we can have proper planning so we know how many plants we can fit in this space to maximize our production. Looking on the back of the seed packet is actually a great place to get all sorts of information about the space requirements of your plants. This is going to show you the depth of planting the seed, the amount of space that we need to thin these things out to, as well as days to maturity. All this information is going to help us properly plan our garden space. One garden crop that I always struggle with is proper spacing for my tomato. When we plant them out in the spring, they're just such small little transplants that it seems like there's just so much empty space in my garden. And then I tend to crowd my tomato plants together. They don't get good airflow. Inevitably, I have disease issues. Leaving this extra space in the spring is crucial for success in the fall. One trick that I like to do with my tomatoes is interplant down the row with basil plants. Basil plants will help fill in that space so it doesn't look quite so empty. Kind of tricked my mind a little bit, but also basil and tomatoes are wonderful companion plants. They actually work together and both crops produce better. We want to make sure that we leave our plants plenty of space so they can thrive and grow and give us an abundant harvest. Another important thing to take into consideration is the maturity date of our plants. While some of our crops certainly can be direct sown, that is planted right out into the garden with plenty of time for them to grow and mature for a good harvest before frost, a lot of our crops don't. Things like tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, they need so much time in the garden that a lot of us just don't have that time before frost hits. So the key here is to plant some of these seeds indoors, under lights, in advance, right? Now, depending on the crop that we're growing, things like tomatoes may need 4 to 6 weeks before the frost date. Peppers, especially those super hots, are going to need even more. Sometimes 8 to 10 weeks even before the frost date. But we also need to know our last expected frost date for our zone. Knowing our last frost date as well as our first frost date in the fall, so we know exactly what plants need to be started indoors and which ones can be direct sown. Other garden crops just need to be direct sown. Root crops like beets and carrots, they're not going to transplant very well, so we're going to want to start them directly into the garden. More cold hardy crops like broccolis, cabbages, those brassicas, they can be started indoors and the little transplants brought out even before your last frost date. Or to keep a continuous succession of planting happening, we can even plant some of those directly right out into the garden during the spring. Now let's go ahead and gather all this information into one place, and this will help us really get a good plan for how we want to get our garden growing. First thing we want to do is let's make a list of all the things we want to grow. I always suggest let's start with things that we love to eat. If we're going to be out working in the garden, we might as well be growing stuff that we just love to eat. Then along with that list, let's include some of the information that we talked about. We could talk about spacing. How much space are these plants going to need? Not just when we put the seeds in the ground, of course, but we're talking about the space that they need as mature plants. How many days until maturity? How long are these plants going to be in the garden before we start to get a harvest, right? So we need to know how much space they're going to take up, how long that they're going to be there, and let's go ahead and write down our last frost dates as well as our first frost dates in the fall. This will let us know how many growing days we've got, and we can see where all these plants are going to fit into the equation. Now, some people are a little bit more visual, and maybe a list isn't going to get the job done for you. Well, remember when we took all those measurements out in the garden? This is a great opportunity. We can use this data to kind of put together a diagram, a real visual, so we can look at this garden and really plan it out. I always suggest using graph paper for something like this. With the pre-measured squares, it's really easy to quickly diagram something out, see how many plants are going to fit into these spaces, and it's really easy to make adjustments as we go. Once we've got our plan in place, it's time to start gathering our equipment to get our planting done. So we're going to need some seed starting mix, right? You can buy a pre-packaged mix if you like. That's the easiest way to do it. Generally, it's a base of peat moss or coconut coir, something like that. Something real light and airy, easy for the seeds to break free from. Obviously some trays to put these seeds in. A lot of times you could buy them together with a little plastic dome. This is going to create a cool greenhouse effect. create a perfect environment for sprouting your seeds. If you're growing warm season crops like peppers, eggplants, tomatoes, those sorts of things are certainly going to benefit from a heat mat. That heat generated from underneath is going to slowly warm that soil and create a perfect environment, just the right temperature for sprouting these seeds. Of course, we're going to need some lighting for the plants as they get to grow, and probably some shelves or something to set these things up on. Once we have our garden plan in place, we can gather up our equipment and go ahead and get planting. The most important thing to remember though, when you're planting and planting your garden, is to have fun. Happy growing, everybody.